When my dad passed away, my stepmom kicked me out. She had no idea who I was. Prologue, the house on Bellard Street. My grandmother used to press a silver dollar into my palm every time I left her kitchen, and she would close my fingers around it and say, "Keep your receipts, Nora. Life will ask you to prove things you never thought you'd have to prove." I was 7 the first time she said it. I was 31 the first time I understood it. The house on Bellard Street had been my father's for 22 years. A craftsman bungalow with a front porch that sagged on the left side and a Japanese maple in the yard that turned the color of old pennies every October. My mother had picked out the kitchen tiles, small white hexagons with a single blue one every 9 squares, a pattern she designed herself. She died in that house when I was 12, in the back bedroom with the autumn light coming through the curtains she'd sewn. After she was gone, the house became the thing I loved about my father. The proof that he had once chosen something beautiful. He married Renata 4 years later. She was fine at first. I told myself she was fine. She had 2 sons from a previous marriage, Derek, who was 17 and already the kind of young man who borrowed things without asking, and Kyle, who was 14 and sweet in the boneless way of boys who haven't yet decided what kind of person they'll become. I was 16, already sleeping on the narrow side of the bed I'd had since childhood, already learning to take up less space. I became a structural engineer. I built a life with foundations so solid nobody could shake it. Nobody except the people I'd spent 15 years quietly trusting. This is the story of the week my father died. The morning Renata handed me a garbage bag and told me to be out by Sunday, and the year that followed, during which the receipts I'd kept changed everything. Chapter 1. Who I was when he got sick. My father was diagnosed with congestive heart failure in January, 2.5 years before he died. I was the one who drove him to the cardiologist for the initial appointment, because Renata had a hair appointment she said she'd already rescheduled twice. I sat in the waiting room with his insurance card and his list of medications written in my own handwriting on a notepad I kept in my car, and I listened while Dr. Paulson explained ejection fractions and fluid management to a man who nodded and didn't fully absorb any of it. I was a project manager at Callaway and Marsh Structural Engineering by then. I'd been there 6 years, had a professional engineer's license in 2 states, and made a salary that I kept private because money in my family had always been a thing that created either contempt or expectation, and I wanted neither. I had a 1-bedroom apartment 20 minutes from Bellard Street that I'd bought at 28, a condo with original hardwood floors, and a balcony where I grew tomatoes every summer. I had a savings account that I funded with the discipline of someone who'd watched a parent get sick and understood what illness actually cost. Nobody in my family knew any of this in precise terms. Not because I lied. Because I'd learned over the years that the version of me they held in their minds was easier for them, and, honestly, easier for me. They knew I worked in engineering. They thought it meant I drafted things, drew lines on paper. Renata once told a neighbor I was a kind of draftsman. My father, God love him, called me the one who's good at math. Derek, who sold insurance and drove a leased BMW he couldn't comfortably afford, treated me the way people treat relatives who work at the DMV. Fond, a little pitying, perpetually certain they understand the ceiling of your ambitions. I let them. I cooked dinner at Bellard Street every other Sunday, helped my dad with his medications when Renata forgot to refill them, and drove him to his cardiology appointments like clockwork. Every visit I brought the notepad. Every visit I asked Dr. Paulson the questions my father couldn't formulate. I understood, probably before my father did, that we were managing a decline, not a recovery. I kept those appointment records in a folder in my desk drawer at home, not for any particular reason, just the way my grandmother had taught me. Keep your receipts. Chapter 2. The arrangement nobody talked about. In the spring of the year before my dad died, Renata started having what she called financial stress. I could see it the way I can see a stress fracture in a concrete beam, a surface that looks fine but has a hairline running through it that will eventually dictate failure. Derek had lost a significant commission and borrowed from his mother to cover his lease. Kyle had moved back in after a breakup and was contributing nothing. Renata had let her part-time bookkeeping work lapse because, as she put it, "Your father needs me here." My father, meanwhile, was worried. He pulled me aside one Sunday in April, while Renata was loading the dishwasher, and told me he was concerned about what would happen to the house. He'd redone his will, he said. He'd worked with an attorney named Gerald Fitch, I wrote the name down, and he wanted me to know that he'd taken care of things properly. He squeezed my hand and said, "You were always the responsible one, Nora. I hope you know I see that." I wanted to ask him to be specific. I wanted to say, "Tell me what the will says, Dad. Tell me the name of the attorney and the office address and the exact language of the document." But he looked tired and a little emotional, and I didn't want to push. He was my father. I trusted that taken care of properly meant what it sounded like. That was the gap in my armor. That single, unchecked assumption. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't learn until much later, was that Renata had been having conversations with Gerald Fitch as well. Not official conversations. Friendly ones. Her sister's husband happened to golf with Fitch on weekends, and it turned out, taken care of properly, had been subject to some revision between April and the following February, when my father's condition suddenly worsened. I didn't know about any of this when I got the call on a Tuesday morning in February that my father had been admitted to Mercy General with acute cardiac deterioration. I drove to the hospital in the clothes I'd worn to a site meeting that morning, hard hat still in the back seat, steel-toed boots, the whole picture, and I sat with him for 6 hours while Renata managed the family phone calls, and Derek stopped by for 40 minutes before saying he had a client dinner. Kyle sat with me in the hallway, and we ate vending machine sandwiches, and he cried a little, which I've never forgotten, because Kyle was always the one who actually felt things. My father died on a Thursday, 9 days after admission. I was holding one hand, and Renata was holding the other, and the room was very quiet, and the winter light through the hospital window looked almost exactly like the light through my mother's curtains 18 years before. Chapter 3. Sunday morning. The funeral was on Saturday. Renata organized it. I contacted the funeral home, handled the death certificate paperwork because the funeral director said I was the first family member in years who'd arrived with a clear head, and I wrote my father's obituary because Renata said she couldn't put it into words. I chose the music. I stood at the podium and spoke for 6 minutes about a man who had been imperfect and loving in equal measure, who kept a bird feeder in the yard even in winter, who called me every Sunday night for 20 years, whether we'd seen each other that day or not. I held it together through all of it. Sunday morning, I came to Bellard Street to help sort through some of my father's belongings, practical items, medications to be returned, that kind of thing. I had a casserole dish I'd brought weeks ago that I wanted to collect. I also, quietly, wanted to sit in that house for a moment and breathe it. Renata met me at the door. She was in a cream-colored blouse and reading glasses, holding a coffee mug with both hands, the way someone holds something for warmth, even in summer. She looked at me with an expression I can only describe as resolved, the expression of a person who has made a decision and preemptively steeled themselves against the response. "I need to talk to you." She stepped back to let me in, but didn't move far from the door. "The house is mine now. I've spoken to Gerald and everything is clear. I need you to collect whatever personal items of yours are still here and be out by this time next Sunday." I stood in the hallway where my mother's coat hook still held the shape of use in the wood, and I looked at Renata, and I said, "Excuse me? I know this is hard timing." Her voice had the particular quality of someone reciting a prepared statement. "But we need to move forward, and there are decisions to be made, and it'll be easier for everyone if we're clear about the situation. The house is mine. Gerald confirmed it." "Gerald Fitch," I said. A small pause. "Yes." "My father's attorney. He handled the estate, yes." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I looked past her into the living room, where my father's chair still held the impression of him in the cushion, where the bird feeder he'd hung from the maple was still half full of seed. "I'll need a copy of the will," I said. My voice was even. This surprised me a little. "I don't think It's a public document once it enters probate, Renata. I'll need a copy of the will." She blinked. In that blink, I saw it, the faint recalibration, the wondering whether she'd underestimated something. "I'll have Gerald send it," she said. I nodded. I collected my casserole dish. I left the house. I sat in my car at the end of the block and breathed for a while, looking at the Japanese maple, which in February was bare and gray and looked like an open hand reaching upward. Then I drove home and called my attorney. Chapter 4. What the receipt said. My attorney was a woman named Camille Desormeaux. I'd hired her 3 years earlier for the purchase of my condo, and we'd stayed in enough professional contact that when I called and said, "My father just died, and I think his will may have been altered, and I need you to tell me what to do right now," she said, "Come in tomorrow morning at 8. I came in with a folder. Here is what I had. 2 years' worth of medical appointment records in my handwriting, each with dates and attending physician names. Receipts for medication copays I had covered when Renata forgot to refill prescriptions. Notes from 4 conversations with Dr. Paulson that I had transcribed from memory into a notebook I kept in my car. A letter my father had written me by hand 3 years earlier. Not a legal document, just a letter, 5 pages on the yellow legal pad he kept by his armchair, in which he described his wishes for his estate in plain English, including that the house on Bellard Street should go to Nora because her mother chose every detail of that house, and some things should stay in the bloodline. And finally, a business card from Gerald Fitch that my father had given me during that April conversation, which I'd clipped to a page in the folder out of the habit of keeping things. Camille read the handwritten letter twice. She set it down with a deliberateness that told me she understood its weight. "This isn't a will," she said. "It has no legal authority, but it establishes intent in a way that complicates any claim that the formal will accurately reflects your father's wishes. He told me he'd taken care of things properly. That was 10 months ago. And you haven't seen the current will." "Not yet. I requested a copy." "Good." She wrote something on her legal pad. "Here's what I want you to do. I'm going to contact the probate court and get a copy of whatever was filed. I'm going to look at the date it was executed. And I'm going to look very carefully at Gerald Fitch's relationship to this family, because what you're describing, a golf course friendship, revisions close to death, a grieving widow who seems very confident about the outcome, is a pattern I've seen before." She looked up from her notes. "Your father was on cardiac medication for over 2 years. Some of those medications affect cognitive clarity. If the will was revised during a period when his decision-making capacity was compromised, that's a conversation worth having in court." I thought about the April afternoon on the back porch. My father had been clear, sharp even, tired, but present. "If it was revised after April," I said, "I want to know when." The will had been revised in December. My father had been hospitalized twice between April and December. Dr. Paulson had adjusted his medication dosage in October, and there was a note in the patient records, which I was entitled to access as a listed next-of-kin contact, a detail I had ensured 2 years earlier by filling out the paperwork, noting mild cognitive fluctuation, patient reports occasional confusion. The will signed in December left the house entirely to Renata. No mention of me. The will signed the previous spring, a draft Fitch had apparently retained, and which Camille obtained through discovery, had left the house to me, with a life estate for Renata, meaning she could live there until she chose to leave or remarry. Someone had convinced a tired, medicated, quietly confused man to sign a different version of his own intentions. Chapter 5. Derek's role. I wouldn't have understood the full picture without Kyle. Kyle called me 2 weeks after the Sunday Renata told me to leave. He called from his car, which told me he didn't want to be overheard inside the house. His voice had the careful quality of someone navigating ice. "I need to tell you something." A pause. "Derek took Dad to see Fitch in November. I wasn't invited. Mom said it was just a quick update, but Derek came home looking, I don't know, satisfied." "Did your dad seem confused in November?" "He was on that new diuretic. He slept a lot. He had good days and bad days." Another pause. "Nora, he asked me in December who owned the house on Bellard Street. He asked me like he genuinely wasn't sure." I closed my eyes. "Did you tell anyone that?" "I didn't know it mattered." "It matters now. Kyle, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." "Okay." "Would you testify to that? What you just told me, the November meeting, the question about the house. Would you put that in writing and repeat it under oath if it came to that?" Silence. Long enough that I prepared myself for no. "He was your dad, too," Kyle said. "I know he didn't adopt you or whatever, but he raised you, and what Derek did, what Mom let Derek do, that wasn't right." "No," I said. "It wasn't." "Yeah." He exhaled. "I'll testify." I added Kyle's statement to the folder. Camille added it to her filing. Derek, when he eventually learned that his brother had spoken to my attorney, stopped speaking to Kyle for 4 months. I know this because Kyle texted me occasional updates from his car, and I came to think of those texts as the small, quiet acts of conscience that remind you the world isn't entirely made of people who choose the easiest wrong over the hardest right. Chapter 6. The Meeting at Fitch's Office. Camille requested a formal meeting with Gerald Fitch and Renata, which in legal parlance is called a mediation preliminary, and in practical terms is the moment when everyone stops pretending the problem doesn't exist. It was held on a Wednesday afternoon in March, in Fitch's office on the 14th floor of a downtown building with views of the river. The office was the kind that communicates authority through furniture: heavy wood, leather chairs, a bookshelf full of volumes that looked read, but probably weren't. Fitch was in his 60s, silver-haired, with the practiced warmth of a man accustomed to being the most trusted person in the room. Renata came with Derek, which told me everything about who had organized this resistance. I came with Camille and a banker's box. Derek looked at the banker's box the way people look at things they should have anticipated, but didn't. Fitch opened with a summary of the estate as filed, the house and its contents to Renata, the modest investment accounts split between Renata and me in equal measure, personal effects to be divided. He spoke in the tone of someone reciting settled law. Camille waited until he finished. Then she opened her own folder and laid 3 documents on the table: the April draft will, Dr. Paulson's October notation regarding cognitive fluctuation, and a sworn statement from Kyle describing the November meeting and my father's December question about who owned the house. The leather chair didn't change. The river view didn't change. But something in the room's atmosphere changed the way a barometric pressure changes before weather. A drop that everyone's body registers before their mind catches up. "We're prepared to file a petition to contest the December will on grounds of undue influence and diminished capacity at the time of signing," Camille said. "We have a documented pattern of cognitive changes, a prior will reflecting different intentions, and a witness to the circumstances surrounding the revision." She let that settle. "We'd prefer to resolve this without probate litigation, but we're prepared for it." Fitch looked at Renata. Derek looked at Fitch. Renata looked at me. I looked back at her with the calm of someone who has built things designed to hold up under pressure, and I said nothing, because Camille was the one talking, and I had learned by then that the most powerful thing you can do in a room full of people waiting for you to break is to simply not break. "What exactly is she asking for?" Derek said. His voice had a thin quality. The insurance salesman's charm stretched past its useful range. "The house," Camille said, "as outlined in the April will. Ms. Renata Alderman retains the life estate interest. She may continue to live there, but title passes to my client." "That's absurd," Derek said. "What's absurd," Camille said pleasantly, "is a December revision signed by a man who was asking his stepson, who owned his own house." Fitch removed his glasses and cleaned them with a cloth from his breast pocket. It was a small, stalling gesture, and we all recognized it as such. Chapter 7. Renata in the hallway. We broke for 20 minutes. I went to the hallway to get water from a cooler near the elevator bank, and Renata followed me. She didn't bring Derek. That meant something. She stood near the window in the hallway, arms crossed, and she looked smaller than she had on the doorstep of Bellard Street, with her coffee mug and her prepared statement. The cream-colored composure had thinned. "I didn't know about the cognitive stuff," she said. "I want you to know that." I poured my water and considered whether I believed her. Partially, I decided. She was a woman who had let herself not know things that were inconvenient to know. "Your son took my father to change his will when my father was confused," I said. "Whatever you knew or didn't know, that happened in your name. Derek was trying to protect my future, at the cost of my father's actual wishes." I drank the water. "Renata, I have my mother's tile floor in that kitchen. I have the hooks she put on the wall in that hallway. I'm not asking for anything my father didn't already want me to have." She looked out the window at the river, which was gray and high with March melt. "If I'd known," she said, and stopped. I waited. "He loved you," she finally said. "He talked about you differently than he talked about the boys. He was proud of you in this specific way. Like you'd exceeded something he wasn't sure was possible. She pressed her lips together. I think I was jealous of that sometimes. It was the most honest thing she had ever said to me. I stood there with my paper cup of water and felt the particular sadness of a truth arriving too late to do anything except acknowledge it. What do you want to do, Renata? She was quiet for a moment. I want to keep my home. The life estate lets you do that. Nothing changes for you day to day. The title changes. And Derek? That's not my problem. She exhaled slowly. When she turned from the window, the resolved look was gone, replaced by something more undefended. Have Camille send the revised terms, she said. I'll sign. Chapter 8. What they didn't know. I want to be clear about something, because this is the part people seem to most misunderstand when I've told parts of this story over the years. I was not secret about my life to be strategic. I was private because privacy had become self-protective, the way calluses are. I'd spent years being the draftsman, the responsible but unremarkable one, the daughter who showed up for appointments and paid for medications and wrote the obituary, and I had built my actual life in the space that existed outside their frame of me, not to surprise anyone, not to set a trap, simply because the version of myself I'd constructed outside that family was the first version I'd ever fully owned. But here is what they didn't know, and what became relevant in the months following the mediation. The house on Bellard Street had a second mortgage on it. Renata had taken it out 18 months before my father's death. I discovered this during the title search Camille ordered as part of the settlement process. The loan was for $47,000. The stated purpose on the application was home improvements, but the actual disbursements, which Camille traced through financial disclosure, went largely to Derek. $28,000 to cover his lease arrears, and a business venture that had dissolved. My father's name was on that loan. I could find no evidence that he had been meaningfully informed of its terms. The house appraised at $312,000. The second mortgage reduced the net equity, but not devastatingly. What it did was reveal the machinery of what had been happening at Bellard Street while I was showing up on Sundays with casseroles and medication refills and appointment folders. The house had been quietly positioned as Derek's financial backstop. The title transferred to me in May. The second mortgage became my problem to understand and ultimately to manage, but because I had the salary and the savings account they'd never thought to ask about, I managed it without crisis, the way you manage a problem you can actually see clearly because you've been keeping your eyes open. Camille sent me the final paperwork on a Tuesday afternoon. I signed in her office with a pen she said I could keep, which I did because I kept things. Chapter 9. The conversation with Derek called me in June. I hadn't expected it. I'd expected silence, or the kind of cold management of shared space that extended families perform at holidays. I hadn't expected him to call from his own number on a Tuesday evening while I was eating takeout at my kitchen table. I want to say something, he said, and his voice had none of the commission-trained ease I was used to. He sounded like a man who had been awake for several nights, considering a problem that didn't have a clean solution. Okay, I said. I told myself I was protecting my mom. A pause. That's what I kept saying. That she'd worked hard and she'd taken care of a sick man for years and she deserved security. She did deserve security, I said. That's not wrong. He stopped. Started again. I knew he wasn't all there in November. I knew it, and I took him anyway, and I told myself it was just formalizing what was reasonable. I didn't say anything. I'd learned by then that the most useful thing you can do when someone is trying to tell you a hard truth about themselves is to not interrupt the effort. I'm not asking for anything, he said. I'm not asking you to let the loan go, or pretend it didn't happen. I needed you to know that I know. His voice cracked slightly. Dad was decent. He was genuinely decent. And I used him. I set down my fork. Yeah, I said. You did. Another silence. He was proud of you, Derek said. I didn't really get that until I heard you speak at the funeral. And then I was angry about it because I don't know what I was. Embarrassed, maybe, that I'd spent all this time thinking I was the ambitious one. You are ambitious, I said. You're just ambitious for the wrong reasons. He laughed once, short and humorless. Yeah, Probably. We didn't resolve anything. There was nothing to resolve, not in the way of a movie reconciliation scene. But when I hung up, I sat for a long time in my kitchen with the takeout going cold, and I thought about how the people who wrong you are almost never the cartoon villains it's easier to imagine them as. Derek had been a middling man in a middling crisis who had made a bad choice and rationalized it with love for his mother. That didn't excuse it. It just made it human, and somehow, the humanness of it was the hardest part. Chapter 10. Bellard Street in July. The house sat empty for 2 months after the title transfer. Renata had moved in with her sister, which she'd done voluntarily. I hadn't asked her to leave, and the life estate was real, not a technicality. But she told Camille, through her own attorney, that she needed a period of separation from the property, and I understood that. Grief takes up physical space, and sometimes you can't stay in the rooms where grief lives without becoming part of it. I went to Bellard Street for the first time as its owner on a Saturday in July. I used the key that had been on my father's key ring since before I could remember, a brass key with a small depression worn into the bow from 30 years of his thumb. Renata had left it for me with the sister, in an envelope with my name on it in Renata's handwriting, which I thought was its own kind of grace. The house was clean. Renata had left it better than she'd found it. The kitchen tiles, my mother's white hexagons with a single blue one every 9 squares, caught the July light and scattered it in the same way they had since I was a child, when I used to count the blue ones as I waited for breakfast. I walked through every room. The bird feeder on the maple was empty, and I made a note to fill it. My father's chair still held his impression. I sat in it, which I'd never done while he was alive. From that angle, I could see what he'd been able to see. The kitchen doorway, the front window, the small framed photograph on the hall table. My parents at a backyard party circa 1988. My mother laughing with her head thrown back. My father looking at her with the specific expression of a man who can't believe his luck. I had taken that photograph from the hall table the Sunday Renata told me to leave. It was still in my car, in the console between the seats, which was perhaps the safest I had ever kept anything. I went to get it. I brought it back inside. I set it in the exact place it had always been, adjusted it until the angle was right, and stood back to check. Then I went to the kitchen, stood in the hexagon light, and called Kyle. "I'm at the house," I said. "How is it?" "It's good. It smells like him." "Yeah." A beat. "That fades." "I know. I'm glad I caught it." "Are you going to live there?" I looked at the tile floor. I looked at the hooks on the wall. I looked at the photograph I could see from the kitchen doorway, my mother's laughing face, my father's stunned gratitude. "I'm going to take care of it," I said, which is the same thing for now. Chapter 11. The bird feeder. There's a thing that happens, I've found, when you fight for something real. The winning doesn't feel like winning. It feels like returning to a place you should never have been removed from. There's no trumpet. There's just the ordinary morning, the keys in your hand, the door that opens when you use them. I moved into Bellard Street in September, after 2 months of weekend work, fresh paint in the rooms that needed it, a plumber to address the bathroom faucet that had dripped for years, and an engineer's systematic assessment of the porch that sagged on the left side, which turned out to need a new support beam and a half-day's work, nothing more. I did the beam myself with Kyle's help on an October Saturday. We levered, secured, checked the level 3 times. When the porch sat straight, Kyle stood back and said, "Dad would have paid someone to do that," and then bragged about it like he'd done it himself. And I laughed hard enough that it surprised me, the way real laughter sometimes does when grief has been keeping the space reserved. The second mortgage I handled quietly, beginning in the fall. I'd restructured my finances, not painfully, not with sacrifice, but with the clarity of someone who had spent years building a foundation precisely because she knew foundations were what you stood on when the ground shifted. Derek never apologized formally or offered to contribute, and I didn't ask him to. What he'd told me on the phone in June was its own currency, smaller than money, worth more in a way I couldn't quantify. Renata came by once in November. She called first. She stood on the now level porch and looked at the straight boards and said, "You fixed it," in a quiet way that meant she noticed more than that. I made coffee, We sat at the kitchen table with my mother's tile floor between us, and we did not have an easy conversation or a dramatic one. We had a plain one, two women who had loved the same man imperfectly, across the distance of a relationship that had never fully found its shape, trying to be honest now that the pressure to perform was gone. She told me she'd been wrong to let Derek handle the November meeting without telling her what he intended. I told her I'd been wrong to never correct the family's impression of who I was and what I'd built, because letting people underestimate you to protect yourself has a cost, and the cost is that they make decisions without accounting for you. I thought you were... She searched for the word. Struggling, I offered. Drifting, she said, like you hadn't landed. I'd landed, I said. I just hadn't announced it. She looked at the tile floor. Your mother had good taste. She really did. Epilogue, October, 14 months later. The Japanese maple turned the color of old pennies in October, just as it always had. I stood on the porch, level now, board solid, with a cup of coffee on a Sunday morning, and watched the light move through the leaves. That deep copper orange that lasts maybe 2 weeks before the leaves let go, and the tree goes bare and gray and becomes the open hand again. The bird feeder was full. A pair of juncos were working it with their efficient, serious expressions, and below them, on the ground, a handful of sparrows cleaned up what fell. My father had believed that what fell from the feeder was as important as what was in it. The ground feeders deserve too, he'd said once, and I'd filed it away the way I filed things. I had files full of him, full of her, full of the whole complicated, frustrating, beloved apparatus of a family that had done me wrong and done me right in roughly equal measure, and which I was learning, at 32, to hold with something other than the clenched grip of someone always bracing for the next impact. Inside on the hall table, my parents' photograph sat at its exact angle. I'd bought a small lamp for the table, a warm bulbed thing that lit the image in the evenings, so my mother's laugh and my father's stunned face glowed when I passed. In the drawer of the same table, I kept a small collection of objects I had moved from my condo when I came to Bellard Street. The pen Camille had let me keep when I signed the final transfer documents. The brass key with the worn bow. Kyle's first text from his car, written in the shorthand, of someone not sure yet whether to trust the person they were texting. It's Kyle. I need to tell you something. Are you around? Printed and folded into a small square. And at the back of the drawer, in an envelope I hadn't opened in years because I didn't need to open it to know what was inside, was the last silver dollar my grandmother had pressed into my palm. The one she'd given me on the last Sunday before her own death, when I was 19 and she was 82, and she'd held my hand over the warm metal and said, for the last time, "Keep your receipts, Nora. Life will ask you to prove things you never thought you'd have to prove." I'd kept them. Every last one. The folder with the appointment records, and the medication copays, and the notes from Dr. Paulson's office. The handwritten letter in my father's loose, cramped hand on yellow legal paper. The business card for Fitch that I'd clipped to a folder page out of nothing more than habit, and which had become, in a lawyer's office on the 14th floor above a gray March River, the small piece of evidence that unlocked everything. I had kept the receipts, and when life asked me to prove things I'd never thought I'd have to prove, I had been ready. I went inside, refilled my coffee, and stood in the hexagon light of my mother's kitchen floor for a moment, counting blue tiles, the way I had as a child, waiting for good things. 27 blue tiles. The same as it had always been. I put down the coffee and got to work.